The first raven came at dusk, gliding along the wrinkled edge of the sea, like a scrap of night torn loose and carried on hot wind. The water gardens slept in colors then, the pools green by shade and coppered by the last light, the children's laughter thinning to a hum in the colonnades, the air perfumed by wet stone and lemons crushed under careless heels. Ariohota watched the birds spiral, an iron flake against the softening sky, and felt the tension that had sat for years in his shoulders gather all at once between his shoulder blades. He gripped the ash haft of his long axe without realizing it, the old grooves molded by his hands like a private scripture. Beyond the lattice, the Prince of Dorne reclined amid cushions, a green silk mantle pooled at his feet, and his swollen joints nested like stones in wool. Doran Martell was speaking softly to two children who had leaned out over the lip of a pool to tie reeds together. His voice as slow, and even as the summer tide. He did not look toward the shadow of wings. Hata did. He had always trusted sky signs more than court whispers. The raven struck the air above the nearest fountain, flared, and came to the wrist of the boy who tended the aviary. The boy flinched, then recovered, his fingers quick and respectful. The bell did not ring. He had not rung it since a winter courier came with news from the Trident years ago. But the boy's face told the truth even before he crossed the courtyard, before the delicate tremor in the water's skin became something else, as if the pools themselves knew there had been a rent torn in the weave of the world. Hata moved, and the sandals of the boy scuffed at his side. "Your Highness." Doran lifted his head together with the dusk, the way of a man rising through pain as if through surf. Layered and patient, he smiled on the children, sent them on with a gentle admonishment about the reeds, and held out his hand. The boy laid the twist of leather and parchment there. The raven's band clinked once against the prince's ring. The seal was blurred by heat and haste, but the sun and spear showed through the smear. "Oberyn," Doran said, as if the name might yet be its own warding. The raven on the parapet cocked its head at the sound. The prince undid the thong with careful hands, his thumbs broad and white with gout. He broke the seal and read. The words did not show in his face at once. Doran's face had been a harbor kept in fog for so long that most men had learned to navigate by bell and memory, rather than daring the rocks. But Ariohota watched close. He saw the harbor draw in, saw the fog thin. The prince's lids lowered. His mouth changed shape without moving. He breathed once as though the air had caught on a treble hook. The prince's hand shook. The parchment rasped. He read again. Twice more. He looked at the boy. "Go. Tell Malario's daughter to come to me." The boy blinked, startled by the formality. "Princess Arianne, my daughter," Doran said, with a steadiness that made Ario's scalp prickle. "Bid her come." The boy flew. Ario remained as he had remained a dozen times when lesser shocks came dressed as great ones, as he had remained since a brave Osi master sold him as a boy to the captain of a guard, bound for Sunspear and fate, as he had remained when Elia's shrouded form returned to Dorne amid sobs that still soaked the walls, if you listened deep enough. "Ario," the prince said, not looking up. "My prince. Shut the gates. No one leaves, no one enters without my word. Send sand serpents if they must ride the parapet to seal it, but it must be shut. It shall be done. A raven to Sunspear, to Maester Caliot." Doran's fingers flattened the parchment as if he could wring it like a cloth, and empty it of meaning. "To Nymeria Sand, to Tyne, to Obara, send for them. They are to come now. And to Lady Nym of Starfall, to Anders of Euronwood, to Lady Illyrian at God's Grace, to all our friends who wear swords and remember Elia. Write this: the Red Viper is dead. 9. The last word disturbed the water. The pools took it in small rings that moved outward between lily pads and the sleeping toys of children. A soundless bell whose wave Ario watched to the marble edge and up the carved legs of the benches, where it vanished into the stone patterns. He let it pass through him too. The echo found old rooms and lit their hearths. "Your word, and it will go," Ario said. Doran's head bowed. He rubbed the paper against his thigh until the seal's wax left a stain. He died in the sight of thousands. He died in the teeth of the mountain. The knight who slew Elias' children slew him. And so, the mountain is a beast, Hota said. Though he offered it merely as a shape he could place his own anger upon. The truth of beasts was that they could be felled, given patience and day enough with good wood. He was Oberyn of the Viper, and he has gone, Doran said. The world wishes to teach me the taste of ashes until I learn to call it bread. Areo waited. The lemon trees set their perfume about them like a silk thrown over a woman's head in play. A child shouted on a distant stair, then hushed, his own voice surprising him in the hollow of a column. I had thought to be older when the day came, Doran said at last, looking up. It was not a confession so much as a weather report. A man who had studied the horizon daily and could not approve of the times the storm chose. Areo, I would stand. He made it part of Hota's duty. The captain came and stood, his chest like a wall under the prince's frail hand. Doran let Areo's strength rise through him and make him, for a little while, more than bone and ache. He stood by slow inches, the way a tower rises from sand, by patient laying of stone, each lift considered and paid for. Arianne came on slippered feet across the mosaic of sea and sun. She had not bothered with a veil. Her hair was unbound and caught in a ribbon at her nape like a captive stream. Her eyes, when she saw the note in her father's hand, went hot and liquid. A wine that had been warmed too near the coals. What news? Oberyn is fallen, Doran said. The princess stopped, as if a rope had been drawn across her path at knee height. She put a hand to the nearest pillar and was silent for 2 breaths, 3, as if the body needed a separate count from the mind to keep its frame. How? She asked. Though the letter would say, though the world would say, though later she would know the grain of sand that had worked its way into Oberyn's heel as he turned, if such knowledge could be had. Tell me each part. Doran did, in a voice that was kind and unadorned by any poetry that might make memory into a shrine. He told of Tyrion Lannister and of a duel bought by words and pride, of Gregor Clegane's raw immensity, of Oberyn's dance. Oh, how his words changed there without meaning to, forgetting the ash on his tongue long enough to let a brother slip his leash and become the blade he had trained to be, for a breath, for a bell, until he was not, and then of a head burst like a melon among devils and fools. Arianne did not cover her face. She did not fall or raise a keening that might become a habit. She listened with her breath held halfway, and when her father finished, she took a full one as if surfacing, as if the pools around them were deep and had finally given up their patient drowning. It is war then, she said, with no drama in it, only a chord struck that had been tuned in the dark for years for this exact note. Yes, Doran said, and the word left him like a bird raised from a hand, glad to be gone and already irrecallable. His eyes, which had practiced softness until they wore it as skin, did not look softer or harder now. They looked awake. Yes. Areo Hota stood at his prince's shoulder and felt the water gardens tilt. Not away from children, though the world was clever at trying to set bright things aside in such moments. Not away from lemons or linen or the sound of water. It tilted toward a road as yet unwalked, toward the Boneway and the Prince's Pass, toward dry riverbeds that could swallow armies, toward the smell of oil on bowstrings, and boiled leather on men who slept in lines like the rungs of ladders laid across Dorne's map. Doran Martell did not speak for a while. He looked over the pool, whose tiles had been made by men long dead and laid by hands that sang, if one believed such things about the past. When he spoke again, his voice had found an older current under the time-worn gentleness he had cultivated as some men cultivate roses or enemies. We do not do this for Oberyn alone. We do it for Elia, for the children who drowned in rumors and were pulled ashore as corpses and never made it to these pools. We do it for a promise I made to my own heart when I could not keep the one I made to my sister. And we do it for Dorne. Nam? Arianne's chin lifted, proud and unshaded. Tell me the manner of our going, she said. Tell me who rides first. The rest of the realm thinks the southern sun breeds only heat in us, not patience, Doran said. Let them learn the patience of sand. But the hour for it, it is past. Ario, send the riders. The bone way is narrow, and yours to judge. I will trust your eyes to decide what passes, and when. Yoronwood must hold the north gate. He will snarl, but he will do it. Anders is a man who likes his instructions as a tailor likes his cloth. He wants enough to make something worth wearing without supplying his own. Give him the pattern, and praise his cut. Then Hota inclined his head, seeing the boneway switchbacks like scars in a palm. A lifeline jagged with cliffs and waterless miles. Yoronwood men were stubborn, but stubbornness in a pass could be a virtue when a flower of reach pikemen tried to force it. He will hold. We will take the prince's pass likewise. The Fowlers owe me old coin and uncollected flattery. They will pay with both and smile, as if it were their idea. Send to Skyreach. Send more to Skyreach than they think they need. If there's to be a hammer, there must be an anvil. If there's to be a river of men, there must be banks. The Reach will try to roll us. Let them dislike the taste of sand. Then? Arianne smiled then. A thin thing, honed on a thought she did not yet share. And Sunspear. Sunspear must become a hive. We will fill it with bees. I want sails at our piers like teeth. Illyrian will send swift light ships, and the Tolans will send anything that floats if we tell them a dragon swims under it. From Salt Shore to Ghost Hill, from the Greenblood to Lemonwood, I want wakes like plowed fields. So, King's Landing sits with the Reach at its table, Arianne said. Tyrell holds the knife and the Lannisters pour the wine and call it theirs. They will not be mild hosts if we bring spears without invitations. Good, Doran said. I have never liked their invitations. When men drink in tall gardens, they forget how high they are, and lean past the rails. Dorn makes no such mistake. Memsawa. Hota felt the words like a new weight settling into his hands where the longaxe was. He saw the invisible road begin to become visible, as roads do the moment someone names them aloud. The water gardens yielded the night by degrees, lanterns coming alive one by one across the arcades, awakening their little summer stars. Servants moved as if the command had been laid years ago, and only now released from parchment, because it had, in truth, and Doran's quiet had concealed it like a chessman held inside a sleeve until the board demanded it. Messengers were fed and shod and given fresh mounts. Maester Calliot, roused from a dream about healing herbs arranged like a color wheel, blinked the sleep from his soft eyes and sharpened quills. The sand snake's names went out into the dark, each line of ink drawn with a pressure that made the parchment fibers sing. When Obara arrived, she came like a thrown spear, short hair damp with the ride, cheeks flushed, the smell of leather joyful on her like a banner. She did not bow. She stood and breathed as though the room were merely a hill she had mounted, and the next one waited behind it, and only when she had put both feet on the tile did she speak. Who? Gregor Clegane, Doran said, and something like pleasure, horrible and true, crossed Obara's face. Not the pleasure of death, but of a named target at last after a season of practice. Nymeria followed her, elegant and knife-eyed, wearing violence like a piece of jewelry one chooses only for particular evenings. Tiny came with her rosewater gentleness, the last perfume to leave the room even after men had washed. Arianne stood slightly behind and to the side of her father, not in the shadow of his person, but in the draft of his decision, a place where cool air ran like the preface to a wind. Hota watched the lines set themselves like soldiers on a drawing. We ride, Obara said. Unnecessary but satisfying to say aloud. We ride through the night. You will ride soon, Doran said. And where you ride will show our friends their own faces. Obara, you will go to Yoronwood to be my anger. Let the Lord of Yoronwood measure it and know its weight. Stay his hand when it lifts too soon. Take its fingers when it is slow to grasp. Nymeria, you will go to God's grace, and from there to the Greenblood. I want our traders and our orphans and our waterlords to feel the heat of the times without scorching. Tine? Tiny smiled, a candle walking around a sleeping room. Father? Tyene, you go to King's Landing. Obra laughed once. To sow or to reap? To pray, Doran said. and Taine's lashes lowered into light at the duplicity. And to count, and to listen, and to poison, if it must be so. The city will know nothing from words it does not already tell itself out of fear. Put an ear to the ground. If it thrums, show me whether the steps belong to Reachmen or lions or something else. He exhaled. Tell me whether the bells are hung for courage or panic. And if the mountain stands? Taine asked, as if asking whether bread could be fetched from the pantry if guests arrive. The mountain will fall, Doran said. Whether by a blade or by his own weight, he will fall. But bring me news, not a corpse. There will be corpses enough for those who want trophies. No. Taine bowed her bright head with a grace made of silk and steel both. As you ask. Your grace, Nymeria said, making the mockery of a court curtsy that nevertheless seemed oddly true in her body. Our cousins of the Reach consider the princes pass a road for oxen and brave songs. It will be a pity to teach them topography. Teach them, Doran said softly. Teach them with flint and dates and empty skins. Teach them what the sun does to men who pack their pride between layers of wool. Lender Rosander. The court, such as it was, dissolved into motion. Wine came that nobody drank. A map was unfurled that had been drawn by a dead man and corrected by 3 more. Its corners held with fruit that would be eaten down to white strings later by boys who would never know the stains were once made by men's fingers laying war across the tiles. Ariohota bent over the map with Doran, with Ariane odor-warm at one side and Abaris impatience like a heat haze on the other. The Boneway ran like a cunning rumor through mountains, narrow one moment, devious the next, offering ambushes to those who could read in rock strata the punctuation of death. The Prince's Pass in contrast wore its danger in the open. The visible sweep where cavalry would want to gallop until their lungs betrayed their thighs and their thighs betrayed their hearts. Sky Reach stood like law upon its cliff. Euronwood, old and proud, offered a sign that said all who go north do so with our consent. We will not give them clean fights, Doran said. We will give them clean thirst and dirty nights. We will let their cloaks grow heavy with their own sweat and watch them put their mouths to skins like children. We will harvest their horses with needles and their pride with broken stirrups. When they are softened, we will choose a place and harden ourselves. The world will call it a battle. Let them. We will call it what it is, an accounting. Now. He straightened with effort. Ario's hands hovered, then lifted the map's western edge, so the prince need not lean so far. Doran looked at him once. You have never left my side, Ario. No, Hota said, who counted loyalty among the simple craftsman's virtues, like balance and oiling hinges. No, my prince. If I die before I see the spears lift against the red walls, Doran said, not allowing the sentence to look at anyone but Hota and the map. You will carry my daughter to Sunspear and put her in my chair. You will tell the horns to sound as if the desert itself had blown through them, and you will say this. Doran fears for children and weeps for sisters, but Doran does not weep. It goes forward. Ariohota took those words inside himself and hung them there, as he did weapons in his private rack, carefully, knowing their weight might be called for swiftly. The night performed its long, necessary miracles. Ravens rose like sparks from braziers. Horses ate and were blinkered and saddled and patted and lied to by men who asked them to forget distances. Far away from the water gardens, in the high courts and hidden atriums of Dorne, the first ripple struck. At Ghost Hill, a girl with a braid like a rope around her shoulder held a lantern over an old chest and found a banner folded so many times that the crease remembered knuckles. She lifted it and sneezed in the dust and smiled. At God's grace, Lady Illyrian took off one ring and put on another that made her hand look like a decree, and the hedge outside the breakfast room, which had been buzzing with bees, hummed with plans instead. At Euronwood, Anders broke a loaf across his knee and looked at the crumbs, and said nothing for a long time, until a boy dared say his name, and he said, "Bread is a map if you are hungry enough," and asked for the messenger. Starfall's white chimera drank moonlight and made it wine. Gerald Dane turned his face into that glow as if daring it to show him a flaw. None showed. He smiled anyway, not needing flaws to love himself. So it is to be now, he said to no one, which is how a man like him preferred to be overheard. 8. Last. The sword at Starfall's heart slept still, and did not come to any hand, because the sword did not care about this war more than any other. Swords are old and know that men's dates are merely a way to number meals. In Sunspear, the mother's men gathered like a cloud of laughter in a room before a wedding, save that their laughter had teeth. Nymeria's girls diced, and the bones fell hot, made of old knuckles polished into the present. The Eulers at Hellholt oiled their quarrels, and did not apologize for how much they enjoyed it. A boy at Salt Shore who had wanted to be a dancer until a week ago stood with his mother at the dock, and watched the mass come in like a forest that had decided walking suited it, and told himself that the world had turned without asking him, and that he would not be left, not if running blistered him to bone. The Boneway breathed. Ariohota rode through it in the first gray before sun, and felt the mountains exhale on his cheeks, dry as old paper and smelling of lizards. The vultures roosted higher up where even goats became conservative. He sent men with long bows and short water to speak to them, so that the vultures might not decide to speak on their own. He saw places where a single fire set in the right moment would roll rocks like dice down a board, and make pieces of men. And he marked them with private names he could share with Anders in the language commanders use. The one that draws circles in dirt and counts out the beads of days as if they were bullets. At the Prince's Pass, Lady Fowler met Hota's second with her hair lacquered into a tower so stiff it might have been a spear built to poke the sun. Her smile said she had been waiting for this since she was 6 and first counted lances at a tourney. Behind her, Skyreach stood like the raised chin of the world. "We know our part," she said before the messenger had finished one elegant sentence. "We have always known it. Tell your prince that his patience has been a garment heavy to wear, but it fit us. Tell him we can be lighter now." Then in King's Landing, the city did what cities do when news comes on invisible feet. It made meanings faster than it made bread. By morning, a woman selling clams on a corner knew exactly how a Baron of Dorne had died, because her cousin's boy worked for a man who had seen the blood on a stone where a rat had licked it. In Maegor's Holdfast, a queen mother whose hair had learned a new way of being arranged daily, sat listening to a singer, and did not hear any of the notes, because she could hear only the words "Dorne" and "War," as if someone had beaten them into the harp and every string cried them. The small council table had a spill of wine that looked like a map of the Prince's Pass if you squinted your eye and hated coincidence. Tyrell men smelled of lavender and iron, and Lannister men stood with boot heels too square and gloves too fine. The bells leaned in their towers and wished for honest work. Tiny Sand walked in that city in a gown that flattered the light instead of her, and nobody saw her do it. She put her ear to stones and learned what they had eaten. Curses swallowed by men who owed money to other men who owed oaths to still other men. Prayers exhaled by a baker whose son had gone into the castle as a scullion the week before and had not come out because a lady no one named had needed more water at night to wash her hair. Tiny smiled and learned and sent her little birds home by ways that did not look like roads. Days grew armor. Knights learned to hide knives in their sleeves. The first blood of the hidden war was spilled not by spear or arrow, but by a cistern poisoned in a fort a day north of Yarnwood, where Reach scouts had paused to drink without asking the stones whose well it had been for 400 years. 6 men died quietly in their sleep under the clean stars. 2 lived and vomited and swore and kept riding because reaching is what they were made to do. Someone scratched a son with spear over the cistern's lip. The mountain did not take sides. It took only whatever rolled down to it. Doran Martell did not ride. He sat in Sunspear on a chair that had watched more patience than any man could count, and he moved small stones on a board that was not a game. He wrote letters that were both mercy and threat in the same ink. He fed the orphans of the green blood and sent their waterlords 3 strings of bells, with the instruction to ring them only when they wanted the world to be unable to pretend it had not heard. He walked his balcony at night and let the sea speak, because the sea had never lied to him. He dreamed once of Oberyn as a boy, white sand stuck to his calves, and a crab in his hand, wicked with small malice and curiosity both. In the dream he told his brother to put the crab back, and Oberyn did, and the little creature vanished under a wave that fled 1,000 miles to another shore, and returned with a far voice in it, "Not yet." He woke with tears drying cool on his cheeks. He did not apologize to the darkness, and did not tell the day what it had seen. Arianne held court where court had never thought to be held, in the barrack yards between racks of spears, under the colonnades where sand gathered in corners like confidential servants, in rooms that smelled of oiled leather rather than roses. She read lists of grain and decided where men would sleep, and where their wives could wait without being harassed by boys who had not learned their bodies were not weapons until someone of rank told them. She laughed twice, full and sudden. Once at a joke too bawdy to deserve such clean sunlight, and once at a child who stole a fig from the table and handed it to a dog with such ceremonial solemnity that no one could be angry. Men rode out from her presence straight-backed and having forgotten, for an hour, the taste of waiting. Oberyn came back from Euronwood with a line of dust down one cheek where a tear had cut it, but she said she had been riding fast. "Anders will hold," she said. "He thinks he is a wall. Let him. He knows how to be built against." Bah! Nymeria sent word from the Greenblood that 3 waterlords had held a race of boats, and the winner had given his boat to Doran's cause with a song so dirty it could have fertilized fields. She sent the lyrics written on fine vellum as if to set them in a reliquary. Tiny sent word in no ink at all. Her news came as a shipment of perfumed oil stamped with a seal. No one would trouble to break because it smelled better unbroken, and thus told Ariohata to break it at once. Inside were notes folded so small that they had learned the shape of secrecy and could no longer be unfolded fully. He read them with a magnifying glass meant to find cracks in steel, and found none in the words. The city was listening to itself with terror's ears. The Tyrells were arguing with their own mouths about whether to pretend Dorne did not exist. The Lannisters were trying to avoid their own eyes in mirrors. There was a rumor that the Hand visited the privy too often. This last made Doran smile in his bones without letting his face know, because men who did not understand how such rumors worked did not understand cities, and such men sometimes spent soldiers the way gamblers spent coins they had been sure were double-headed. The first true clash in the prince's past did not have a proper name. Names come later and are a kind of theft. That morning, a pale mist lay like an old quilt across the lower reaches, and the Fowler men had laid their own quilt beside it, made of thorns tied with string at a height to catch horse knees. Reach cavalry came on with impatience, their green cloaks too clean for anyone's comfort. Trumpets little golden lies about order. The mist did what mist does. It ate edges and made men believe spaces were kind. The first 3 horses screamed and went to their knees with thorns driven into their joints like opinions. The 4th leapt and took 2 strides before a Fowler dart took him in the throat. The Reachman tried to spread right, then left, and found rock waiting on both sides with the patience of geology. A Fowler boy not yet bearded cut a trumpet from a man's hands with a hook, meant for figs, and later did not sleep. Not for pride, but because the sound he had made stopping the note had become a new note that rang on inside him. Anders Euronwood held the boneway with contempt, which is to say he held it as if it would disappoint him if it tried to offer him anything too dramatic. He signed orders without flourishing, and sent men without speeches, and looked at maps as though they had insulted his mother. He stalled a column of men for a day, with a single wall built sidewise across the path with stones that had once been a watchtower, and were now a lesson. When the column tried to turn back, he sent 10 men to light small fires on the slopes, so the opponents would think 1,000 had been waiting. He did not smile when they believed it. He smiled later, when he was alone, because he disliked giving the world the pleasure of seeing his teeth. He sent word to Doran in a sentence that told a whole battle. They came wanting road. We gave them homework. News from King's Landing came as news does, with too many hands on it, some of which tried to wring it into their own shape. Tynene's thin scripts told Doran quiet things that added to a larger shape. There was talk in the Red Keep of healing the mountain by methods that did not care what a man looked like when he was healed. There were whispered plans about a match for the young king that would set the Reach and the lions at the same table with knives under napkins. There was, above all, fear of a thing that had not happened, but looked like a woman on the horizon, with a crown of fire and 3 shadows like wings. These rumors were old as well, and had been walking the city like whores who were too proud to haggle. Doran gathered them into an understanding, and did not touch the crown or the wings. He touched the knives, because knives were the part for which he had cloth. A letter came to Sunspear written in a careful hand that once had belonged to a girl who read poems. It belonged now to a woman whose fingers had learned a harp of different strings. It was signed by Marguerite Tyrell. The letter said, with grace and without using the word, that she understood grief. It asked without begging whether the Prince of Dorne would consider the memory of the children who had splashed in his pools, and whether he wanted other children to splash there also, or whether he preferred to make the water wine for a while. It offered a small thing that was in truth a large thing. A hand sent across a table that was too long for comfort. Doran read it twice. He folded it once. He set it by his cup of lemon water, and did not answer until morning. His answer was not long. It said this: "The pools remember, and so do I. I would like the children to laugh." It also said, "When the man who crushed my sister's children under his hands is shown to be no longer in this world's reckoning, we can speak. Until then, I will teach the Reach the names of my passes, and if they remember them later as parts of a prayer, I will not be offended." He sent the letter by a fast ship. The wind did what the wind does. The ship's wake was a line under the sky as straight as a sentence that does not lie. Night came over Dorne with fewer stars each evening, as the dust of moving men stood up to compete with them. At the water gardens, the children still came. Doran made them come, even when their mothers fretted, and their fathers talked too loudly about the price of dates, because the price of iron made them nervous. The prince sat by the pools with his gout and his grace, and sometimes with his daughter at his side, and he watched laughter work like medicine too cheap to be most men's first choice. The courtiers whispered that it was unseemly to sit among splashes when letters were being written in blood. But the courtiers said this to one another, and never to Doran, because he had made the water gardens a palace larger than Sunspear, by calling it a promise. Ariohota stood at his place. He sharpened the long axe with a stone carried from a river in Norvos, and thought of that river sometimes, of the boats that moved on it like Patience. He imagined himself old by another 10 years, then 10 more, and wondered if the axe would still choose to be held by him. He watched the sand snakes pass like different kinds of weather, each with her own temperature and threat of rain. He watched Arianne refine herself, hour by hour, into the woman Dorne would have had sooner if Doran had not needed her to be a girl long enough to learn where the worst shards lay in the sand. One late afternoon, when the sun was busy in the gardens with its alchemy of color, and the ravens had gone to their ropes and said rude things to the lizards, a messenger came from the prince's pass with blood on his boot, where a horse had stepped on him after dying. He delivered his words to Arianne because Doran was hearing a petition from a waterlord, whose daughter had married badly and wanted it to be the world's fault. The messenger spoke, and Ario watched Arianne's face clear, and then cloud in an instant, the way the sky over a salt pan becomes a mirror. And then, with a single small wind, a map. "Say it again," she said. "The Reach," the messenger repeated, swallowing, "has sent a ladder to our wall that they believe is a staircase. They come in columns with pennants like flower stems. They have a singer who rides beside their lord and plays something cheerful. Lady Fowler says she will take his instrument and make a cooking fire with it before sup." "Gan." Arianne nodded. "Tell her she can eat late tonight," she said, and sent him for wine and a pillow for his foot. And the messenger cried, because he had thought himself invisible to rank. She went to Doran and stood until the waterlord had finished blaming gods for the price of salt. She stepped into his silence as into a bath. "Father, it begins." He looked at her and threw her at the map that hung invisibly in the room. "Yes," he said. "Then let it begin as we choose, not as they dream." He rose, with difficulty and dignity. He leaned on Ario and on Arianne both, not because he needed 2 supports, but because he wanted 2 generations in his grasp as the world turned under them. They went to the balcony. The sea was a polished blade. The city's roofs were like scales. The air came up from the water and told their clothes small secrets about the evening. Doran raised one hand, and a horn sounded from the Tower of the Sun, a note that had lived in stone a long time, seed sound of all the notes to come. In the barracks and on the walls, and in the courtyards where women fed boys and told them to keep their hands open until commands filled them. Men stood. In the passes, other horns answered, each a translation of the same long word in mountain and wind. In the Greenblood's maze, bells took the note in their cupped palms and gave it back, shaken, shining. In King's Landing, Tyene listened to the air from a window slit cut when the castle had been younger and less proud. She smiled with her mouth and not with her eyes. She put a tiny white flower to her nose, so small it could have been dismissed for a mote, and breathed its plain scent. "Now," she said to the city, "now show me where you crack." Along the Prince's Pass, the sun lowered until it could put its red hand on the backs of the horses and let them sweat bright. Fowler men crouched behind stones that had learned the shape of men long before this day. The Reach's trumpet tried to explain the future and failed. Obara Martell rode up out of a wash of scrub, careful as a cat, stepping between amphorae. She had her spear upright, its butt knocking idly against her thigh as if happy. At her side, a thin man with a scar offered her a waterskin and a guess about how proud men would react to a ditch they had not expected. "They will fill it with their dead," she said kindly, and handed the skin back. Night would come, then dust, then blood, then letters, then more horn notes and their long stone echoes, then 1,000 choices, none of them neat. Doran looked at the horizon as if waiting for someone to arrive who had been promised long ago, and was late, but coming. He put his hand on the parapet's warm stone and let the heat run into his bones. "Oberyn," he said again. But the way a man speaks a prayer he knows will be heard because he intends to be its answer. The air did not move. The lemon trees set their perfume, brave and domestic. In the rooms below, servants folded banners that had not seen light since another generation's grief. And they found them good, no moths and no rot, only color, red sun, golden spear, the promise the desert keeps even when men do not, to remember what it has watched. A wind came at last, slow, educators slow, and lifted the ends of Erion's hair. She closed her eyes. Eriohota lifted his longax a fraction to feel the weight anew. The horn gave the second note, the one that means not gathering but going, and the sound went out through the city and past it and into the passes where it braided itself with echoes until men could not tell which note had been first, or whether the first mattered when one had the rope made of many. They went. Dorne moved the way a dune moves, when it decides the shape of the path is less important than its arrival at the sea. It did not rush. It did not falter. It flowed in 1,000 small motions that, seen together, made a thing no man could push aside with a hand or a law. Spears rattled softly like reeds in a shallow river's bed. Women tied hair. Boys sharpened iron and told their dogs to wait. Princes wrote. Sisters smiled with their knives. The water gardens filled with laughter, while the walls of Sunspear learned again the weight of shadowed men. Under an accountable sky, the desert lifted its long-remembered promise and carried it north. Night came without thunder. It slid down the ribs of the mountains and pooled in the hollows, and there it learned new shapes from rock and men, from thorn and spear, and from the slow breath of horses who stood quartered with their noses to the wind, as if the air could be read like a prayer. In the Prince's Pass, the Fowler sentries lay in 2s and 3s, among stone teeth worn so even by centuries of sky, that a man could not tell whether the mountain had been gnawed by weather or by wars. They waited in a quiet that was not peace, but its cousin. Useful, steady, a table cleared before bread. Obara Martell moved among them with her spear over her shoulder, and her hair damp under a rag twisted to keep the sweat from her eyes. She did not crouch when she walked. She planted the soles of her boots and took her share of the ground. Once, in the near dark, The boy touched the shaft of her weapon, as if to take some of its certainty into his palm. She let him, and did not look down. "Drink," she told them, "and do not drink twice." Her voice was stripped of opinion, the way a good blade is stripped of decoration. Dawn smudged the east like a thumb across charcoal. That was when the Reach captain sent his trumpeter forward to test the air. The horn poured out a bright sequence of notes that had been fashionable on the tournament greens of Highgarden 2 summers ago, and were now ridiculous here, on stone, with men and thorns rather than ladies and garlands to answer them. The mist still clung to the low places, 1,000 small latrines for fear to crouch in, if men allowed it. Obera lifted her spear. The thorns were placed just where the horses wanted to put their knees to climb. The mist obligingly hid the worst of them and revealed just enough to make pride say, "It is nothing." The first scream was animal and clean. The second was a man. After that, the sound ceased to be distinguishable as this or that, and became only a sound with teeth. And the fouler archers let it make them calm rather than hot. Thrice an officer tried to dress his line to the left, then to the right, and thrice Rock said no. The fowlers did not rush. They took their shots like men mending nets, each stitch measured so that the next would find its natural place. A halfway famous singer carried in the Reach captain's wake, his cloak white and green, his instrument's belly fat and varnished. His fingers slipped once on a chord, and then he smiled, because that is what such men are trained to do, and he had not yet learned there are places where smiling makes the air colder, rather than warmer. He lived long enough to see Obara stand up on a rock with her spear's point against the sky, and to understand that his next song would be winter. When they dragged him down later, she did not let the boys do what boys wanted to do. She took the instrument and broke it across her knee, and fed its shards to a fire, and said simply, "Eat, then piss on it, because it was good to teach the mountain the roster of tastes with which this war would be seasoned." By mid-morning the Reach had learned enough to stop pretending it was not in a pass. Its captain sent riders upslope to seek gentler ground. They did what riders always do when the terrain lies, toes seeking purchase, knees telling lies to thighs, thighs lying to hearts. A fowler girl with her hair in a knot like a fig stem hit the first rider with a stone from a sling, and watched the man fold like cloth, and slid back on her belly to ask for one date for luck. She ate it so slowly that even Obara looked away, embarrassed to watch pleasure held that carefully in the mouth. When the horn sounded the withdrawal, it did so without shame. The retreat was clean, more clean than men who called orchard lands their teacher had any right to manage. And Obara nodded once without smiling, because respect belonged to competence even in foes. They left 5 horses tangled in thorns and 24 men who could not be lifted without coming apart. A boy of 12 sat on a stone with a line of blood across his cheek, like a new scar taught to read, and cried silently, because the tears made him comfortable, not ashamed. "Water," Obara said to him, and he drank and hiccuped and laughed at the same time, and that was how the day ended for him. Ariohota took his breath in the boneway in the shadow of a leaning tower that had fallen before he was born and chosen to make its reclining position a virtue. He listened to the mountain. Wind writes letters there with great patience, and in a hand so small most men think the rock is blank. Ario read words he had known before he had words. Here you do not hurry. Here you make the world come to you. Here you do not lift more than you can hold all day. Anders Euronwood met him on a slope of shale, with a look that suggested the boneway's tricks were amusements to him, only because they allowed him to feel righteous in his disdain. "They will send Tarly," he said without preface, as if naming the commander were the last sensible thing the world would do. "Not at once, not until their first crop of fools has ripened and been harvested, but they will send him. He thinks straight, and I despise him properly for it." "Straight lines can be broken with curves," Ario said. The words simple enough that Anders smiled a small private smile, as if he had been told a clean joke. They walked the switchbacks together. Ario showed him a shelf that would carry 20 men and collapse under 15 horses. Anders showed him a place where rain had undermined the rock so cleverly that a single fire set on an afternoon with a southerly breeze would turn a column of men into a map of new gullies. They marked the places with cairns of 3 stones, and then each put one flat palm upon them. Two men of different tempers entering a contract with rock as witness. "Your prince," Anders said as the sun climbed a hand and a half, "never loved me." "He loves Dorn," Areo answered, and Anders made a noise meant to be cruel and failing to be. "That is a way of loving," the blood royal conceded at length, "which I suppose is better than some others." "Very well. I will hold your north gate. I will do it without songs and with economy, which is how I do all things. Send me boys who can count, and men who can look at a stone and not make it into an altar." "I will send you what I have," Areo said, and they gripped forearms as if closing a door. In King's Landing, the word of Oberyn's death grew into other words with the speed of mold on bread. Tiny Sand wore a plain gray and a thinner smile, and walked the steps of Baylor with a basket on her arm that smelled of lavender soap, though there was none inside. She had learned the city's voices within 2 days, not their names but their familiar chords. A baker carried his baskets as if they were his sons, and a fishwife dragged her nets as if she distrusted the notion that fish were not still attached to them. The bells kept their counsel above it all, each with its own idea of what a day ought to be. She went to a certain alley at a certain hour and put her basket down and asked for water. The boy who brought it was nobody in a city made of nobodies, but the bruise on his arm said he had been cuffed by a hand that wore a glove without padding, and such gloves were worn by men who thought about their hands more than their mouths. She gave him a copper, then 2, then said, "Tell your aunt that the little white flower with the plain scent is in bloom." And the boy looked at her as if he'd been made to swallow a fishbone, and nodded and went. Cersei Lannister held court in a room that had too many mirrors for a woman who had not sat with her true self long enough in any dark. The Tyrell men were thick upon the carpet. The room smelled like a garden imitating a bathhouse. Margaery sat 3 chairs down with hands folded and an expression that did not quite succeed in being unbearable. Tiny admired her for that. Pretty, clever, almost good. The hand sat at the head of the table and did not look like a man accustomed to not having the last word. That night, the last word left him. Tiny did not need her birds to tell her it had been a quarrel with a sun set on the edge of a world that had always been his toy. She did not need their whispers to tell her where the quarrel had ended, nor on what seat, nor with what ridiculous weapon. She knew the city's rhythms. When the rhythm missed a beat, she knew it had stumbled. When the rhythm started again too fast, she knew it was running. She let the whispers add garnish. They said crossbow. They said privy. They said a woman's name in a tone that made the air itch. They said the dwarf had fled by a road. Mice know. She wrote Doran of Dorne, a note upon a scrap of vellum fine enough to be rolled into the hollow of a reed. She wrote it twice with 2 different hands. She cut each line and stitched it back together with wax, so a man reading it might never be sure where his sentence would end. She folded and refolded until the vellum learned to be small. Then she sent it in a pot of oil that smelled of rose while the guards at the gate took long, appreciative breaths and did not think to touch the seal. In Sunspear, Doran read by candlelight while the rooms around him were full of sleep, and women walked in linen, and boys dreamed of horses they could not yet ride. He read and then set the note on the lip of the candle and let the flame take it. He spoke aloud into the dark because he had not often allowed himself that indulgence. The lion is toothless at the jaw for a day. Perhaps 2. He did not smile. The game board in his mind altered not by pieces moved, but by weights lifted and dropped. He tapped the stone that marked Myrcella's chamber and kept his finger there a long time. In the morning he called for Areo-Hotah, and for Arianne, and for Maester Caliot. And he called for the boy Trystane, and for the girl who had not asked to be any kind of queen, in a world that wanted queens to be hats men put on. They came into the solar with the sea laying a line of light at the horizon, as if showing where the page ended. Myrcella wore yellow and white, and looked like a piece of the water gardens that had remembered to put on shoes. She had grown in Sunspear. That was the important thing. She had learned the weight of heat, and the courtesy of shade, and the truth that water is food. Trystane took her hand as they sat, not boyishly, but as a man who had already chosen the place his hand preferred to rest in this life. Doran's voice had always been a good bed for decisions to sleep in. Today it woke them, The hand is dead. Cersei will take her son and crown him with her fear. The city will turn upon itself and then try to turn upon us with hands full of knives. Before their knives are chosen, we must choose our law. Then Shawand. Areo listened to the word law and put it with the passes, with the green blood, with the tooth of the bone way. In Dorne, law had edges. It cut differently than other men's laws. Here, a woman inherited. Here, a girl who became a woman was not told to apologize for it. The rest of the realm had tolerated this so long as Dorne did not ask the rest of the realm to be measured by it. Perhaps that season had ended. Arianne's mouth tightened, not in disapproval, but because she could taste a certain dangerous ripeness in the air. Say it, she told her father. Feminine grace turned into a wedge that opened a hinge. We will crown Myrcella, Doran said. And there it was, the promise made public. By our law, the throne belongs to the elder child. Joffrey is dead. By that reckoning, Myrcella is the first of Cersei's children. She is wed in all but the ceremony to my son. The crown at King's Landing wears us as an ornament when the light suits them. Today, we become the light. We will declare what is so in Dorne to be so for all the world. If they call it rebellion, then I have been a rebel since my sisters taught me to prefer water to wine. Nay. The room moved in small ways. Maester Caliot swallowed. Areo felt his pulse climb one stair, then stop and stand, waiting. Tristane's fingers tightened on Myrcella's without hurting her. Myrcella herself did not cry out or swoon or look at any mirror, seeking whether she had somehow become a picture with a different border. She took a breath, and to Ario's surprise and private admiration, put her free hand upon the desk, and said, "What would you have me say, my lord?" Doran folded his hands over his gout. "Say what is true. That your mother's blood sits the throne now, and it is your father's name she uses to claim it. Say that by the law of the Rhoynar, which is older than the stones of the Red Keep, you are queen. Say you will not be used, and that you will not be cruel. Say that you will not forgive men who crushed babies. Say that if the realm would live in peace, it must first learn to remember which children mattered." Men or wine. Her eyes shone, but not with tears. It was another kind of wetness entirely, like a fish rising. She nodded. "I will say it." Arios' mind, practical as a ledger, wrote a parallel list in small neat script. Guard the girl, double the post at the Prince's Tower. Move the oil and the rocks and the firepots up 2 stairwells. Put men he trusted in the kitchens and the stables. Make the archers practice at dusk when the light lies. Keep Dark Star farther than a day's ride from any ceremony. He would speak to the Danes at once. They made the hall ready with a speed that would have been scandalous if it had not been for war. Banners were shaken free of sleep. The musicians tuned as if fearing strings would choose to be silent witnesses. 1,000 sandsilk streamers were lifted from chests and hung like the memory of rainfall. People came, lords and ladies, and those who owned nothing but a knife and an opinion. The green-blood waterfolk brought their bells and did not ring them, out of respect, which was their way of ringing them without sound. Myrcella walked beside Doran into the long room that had made princes taller and fools smaller for 200 years. Her hair shone like a new coin held up to sun to see if it is true. Trystane walked at her left, his hair a darker gold, his back straight. Arianne spoke first. Not a proclamation, not yet. A story. She told the room the tale of the Royne's queens who were not queens, as the rest of Westeros meant the word but mothers and keepers of law and breakers of invaders. She told of Nymeria burning her ships and of the day when she looked at a martell and said, "I will make the sun and the spear one thing." She told it without embroidery, but she stepped on the boards with each word so that the room felt weight and not just weave. Then Doran spoke. Slower. He did not say many names. He said Ilya. He said Rhaenys. He said Aegon. He did not say Oberyn until the end, and when he did, it was not as a battle cry, but as a promise given to the dead that the living would not be cowards. They put a crown on Myrcella's head, a simple circlet of yellow gold, an old Dornish thing with leaves rather than points. She did not sway under it. It looked on her as if it had been waiting at the edge of her childhood all along. She took Tristane's hand openly when the hall roared its approval, and Ariohota watched 50 men decide, then and there, that they would die for her, and watched 10 decide that they preferred their old world to this newer one, and so must be watched like jars left too long in storeroom. Word flew, as word does. King's Landing did not so much receive it as cough it up from its own gut. The city had always known how to make truth into rumor and rumor into wound. Cersei's face, when the news was read, was a face that had been trained too long to hold one expression, while the rest of the head shouted. She broke a cup and did not bleed. Margaery's hands did not move at all, which was a more impressive phenomenon than the cup. The small council met. It had lost its ceiling of certainty, and the sky above it was a thin blue, anxious as a bruise. Maester Pycelle wobbled his way into long sentences, like a man stepping into a bath that had not been tested for temperature. Qyburn stood grateful for any shadow that admitted him. He was a gentler kind of monster than most of the cities, but a monster nonetheless, with hands that believed they were eyes. Mace Tyrell swelled with the need to say that no upstart desert law would instruct the soft green of the Reach. He offered to march. Of course he did. He offered to bring roses into stone and teach them to be vines. "Send Sir Randall," Margaery said, head tipped, not looking at her father, speaking to her cup. "He counts. Father counts the way children count flowers." She did not say it cruelly or loudly. Cersei did not hear her or pretended not to. "You will go with all your strength," she told Mace, and the Lord preened as a pigeon preens in a windowsill. "It believes to be a throne. You will teach them to take their sand and bake it into bread, and then we will make them eat it. I want Dorne bled until the water in their pools tastes like iron." Qyburn coughed his careful cough. "Your Grace, the matter of Sir Gregor." "The matter of Sir Gregor is that he is dead," Cersei said, too quickly. "He is dead to Dorne. Soon he will be dead to us, and thus no one will own him. Send a skull. Any skull big enough will do." The Dornish read only symbols. Some of us read them well. Tiny murmured 3 streets away to a woman selling eels, but the woman did not know she had heard the Queen speak, and so she wrapped the eels in rushes and gave 1 extra for luck. Tiny let the fish oil seep into her fingers and wrote another note with a hand that did not smell of roses this time, but of river. Dorne's first week of war felt like a 5-day wind prolonged by the stubbornness of one stubborn cloud. Men died in 2s and 10s and were buried without swords because swords were scarce. Boys learned that hunger is not an enemy unless you let it be your commander. Women learned the schedules of ravens. Ariohota slept 3 times in 7 days and did not dream. He did not trust a mind that would choose to entertain fiction in a week like this. Gerald Dane of High Hermitage came with a smile that took Ario back to a day he had once witnessed when a boy had stolen a knife and convinced himself he had invented blades. The Dark Star sat his horse as if the saddle were a swear word. "So," he said to Arianne, "we make queens now. Have you decided what a king is good for?" "Archers," Arianne said without looking at him. "And letters." She let him linger until he became bored, and then sent him with 20 good men to do a bad job. Harry a supply train that came too near to King's grave. He came back 10 days later with a ring in his pocket, and too much relish in his tale of how its owner had lost his finger. She took the ring and gave it to a boy whose mother had lost hers years ago stripping palms. She told Darkstar to show her where the supply train would next choose to be careless. He showed her a place where it would be very costly to teach them care. She sent Obara instead. In the Prince's Pass, the Reach came again with more caution and less song. Their outriders wore cloth over their mouths to break the dust, and their horses had learned to keep their noses soberer. A man with a sense for terrain rode ahead and marked thorns and culverts with little flags whose modesty was nearly touching. Obara watched him like a cat watches a new cat trespass upon a wall. It believes to be its own. When she moved, it was not to strike him. He was doing his work well. She wished him no harm for that, but to show him a place where his flags would lie, and another where they would be pulled. Lessons, both ways. He learned to fear a figure who stood without crouching. She learned to respect a mind that could memorize 500 paces with a glance. The fight that followed was not a slaughter, and therefore, it was a victory. The fowlers gave ground like cloth pulled from a cut, slow, resisting, leaving threads to tangle in the enemy's fingers. A reach knight in primrose yellow took 3 darts, and kept his seat and nodded to the woman who had thrown them. And she nodded back, and then he died when his horse put one foolish foot into a hole. A goat would have known better than to trust. Men stacked as they fell. The air stank of wet iron by noon and goat by 2. At last Harley's banner came into view on the ridge, bore his head straight, and the line behind it steadied as if the sight were physical meat. Obara withdrew then, because there are times when honor is a tax paid only by fools. Let them hold that ridge, she told her lieutenant, a boy whose freckles looked like dirt spattered on a plate. Let them have a victory to write home about. Make the home drown under the weight of their letters. She pulled her men back out of range and smiled at the ridge, not with love, but with the pleasure of seeing a man in a chair that had been placed upon a trapdoor. In the night, she sent 10 boys with hooks and quiet feet to drag the thorns upslope where horses would tomorrow think themselves safe. It is a comfort to teach plants to move. In the Boneway, Anders Euronwood told a mason to wall a bend that had far too long wanted to be a shortcut. The mason did it, swearing the way men swear when they are asked to outwit stone. 2 days later, a company of Reach pikemen arrived, and found their map disagreeing with the world in the kindest possible way. They took out their impatience upon the wall, and then upon a goat which, being innocent, died for their sins. On the 3rd day they sent a small brave man with a flag of truce to ask whether the Dornish knew they were rebels, and whether they wished to die as rebels die. Anders sent him back with the reply that he had never been a rebel in his life, and intended to die like a man who was at dinner. Later, with his belt loosened and his wine poured, the truce-bearer reconsidered his profession. The green blood turned into a road of its own. Nymeria Sand's letters described it with a satisfaction that tasted like ripe fruit. Little boats ghosted between reed-choked shallows with sacks of grain that had been hidden under mats so long their smell had persuaded the mats that they were family. Water lords rang their bells with a strict grandeur none of them truly felt, and children lay on their stomachs along the banks to tug at the lines of boats in places where the current sulk. Once, a Reach patrol on the sandy west bank tried to board 3 boats at a time, and found themselves instead swimming with eel-quick men who had cut their belts and their purses and tied their ankles with a finesse that would have shamed a courtier. The boats went on, and the patrol came out of the river with their dignity like wet parchment, salvageable if dried carefully, useless if handled with heat. At Sunspear, men who had never worn steel began to wear it without grimace. Women took spears off racks with the mild entitlement of people selecting baskets at market. Myrcella sat in the morning with a septa, and in the afternoon with Arianne, and in the evening with Ariohota, who explained to her, without affection but with respect, that rooms had angles that were kinder to arrows than others, and that doors without crossbars were lies. She listened, and asked questions that showed she understood that ignorance is a horse that must be broken the first time it tries to ride you. She ate when told, slept when told, and once said to Trystane, "If I am queen, will I be allowed to be a girl again later?" And Trystane, whose father would have loved him if there had never been any title to give him, said, "I hope so," and kissed her hand as if this were not the worst prayer he had ever made. News from King's Landing came bundled with other news like sticks tied by a poor man who hopes to sell them as a proper faggot. Tywin dead. Tyrion fled. The gold cloaks paid late, a septon preaching in the market that queens must be humble. The red wine fleet short of casks, because the arbor had chosen this year to be less bountiful. A rumor that dragons flew in the east with a woman on their backs whose hair refused every comb. Doran read everything, and took care to give no one piece too much weight. He wrote letters to the Ullers, which amounted to saying, "Do what you do, but do it to my beat." The reply was a sack of crossbow bolts missing their heads, because an Uller's humor looks like treachery until you are old enough to read it. He wrote to the Tolans, and Nymela sent back a drawing of a dragon upon her letterhead. Then a second letter 3 days later, explaining that the first had been jest and here now were ships. Doran smiled fully once that day, then went back to making salt into law. He sent Obara with a flying column through the Boneway, not to break upon Blackhaven or Nightsong like a wave upon a cliff, but to find Summerhall's bones and make a signal fire there that could be seen, if not believed. The ruin waited in its ring of trees like a burned cake in a dish that has nevertheless been kept on the table as if it might still be cut. Obara rode into the ash with 30 men and 1 banner, and lifted the banner on a spar so dry it wanted to be fire. She did not set the fire. She had no desire to call ghosts. She merely wanted the rumor to learn the way here, and to learn the words to say, on its way back to men who had never in their lives understood that some places are not improved by hands. At dusk a party of Marcher men-at-arms appeared at the tree line, their captain wearing Charon's badge upon his breast. He lifted his hand. She lifted hers. Neither of them made speeches. He asked, "What do you want?" She said, "To remind you that your borders are held up by places as well as men." He chewed this as a monosyllable, and then withdrew because he did not want to make a fight out of a thing that did not look like a fight, any more than a little girl wants to be told the name of every plant in a field. Tarly came at last in the Prince's Pass with 30 banners, and the kind of cold clarity men mistake for cruelty. He dismissed the singer entirely, to his credit, and he burned his own dead atop their horses, so that the smell of cooking horse would make hunger smaller in young bellies. He sent little squads by night to count fires, and to make fires of their own where there were none. He removed his trumpeters for 2 days, and let silence become an instrument. He sent out small coins in the hands of men who asked questions that were not truly questions. He moved like knife work. Lady Fowler, who had by now had the courtesy to write Doran telling him that she was simply Lady Fowler, and her name was not his concern, answered with a day of absence. She drew her men back so far that the pass looked empty. Tarly came on with a caution that was almost respect. At noon, when his men were unloosing their breastplates to scratch at sweat rashes, and the cooks were looking at the sun to see whether it was time to lie about the food, the pass erupted with stones. Not boulders rolled by men in shirt sleeves, that is for mummers, but stones pried by levers and set by pry bars over 3 long days, arranged on ledges so cunningly that a goat would have murmured approval. They slipped, and then danced, and then thundered, and a dozen men died laughing without having chosen to laugh because the sound in their chests had been given to them by falling. The reachmen held. Tarly held them. He hated the mountain, but he told it so privately, and in words so small, the mountain could not be bothered to answer. He found the men who had sent the stones down, 2 old shepherds, and a boy with 1 eye. He hanged the boy and let the old men go, because he remembered that nothing makes war uglier than men who hang everything they can lift their arms to. Obara, from her vantage, measured him anew and cursed him without heat for being the thing that cost her more blood than fools. He will come again, she told her lieutenant. Good. We are learning. In King's Landing, Coyburn took the mountain's ruined form down into stone and candle, and made the room into a question. He hummed because the air of the place required the noise of a man to make it less holy. He wrote in a calm hand, and when he had no ink, he wrote in something else. He told Cersei that death could be taught new manners if one were a good teacher. He was perhaps right. Tyene watched a boy go in with a bucket and come out with an empty face, and put him in her memory beside the names of men who could carry letters out of the city without thinking too hard about what was in them. Marguerite visited the sept and watched women light candles. She moved among them like a kindness that wears perfume. She knew the smell of power, the way a good miller knows the feel of grain, and she could tell it had changed. She sent a letter south as well, but hers went to Old Town and spoke of books and ships and grandparents. A reach queen knows the roads that are not roads. Myrcella ate dates she did not quite like to please old ladies, and then, alone with Arianne, admitted that she did not quite like them. "You do not have to like everything here to love it," Arianne said. And Myrcella nodded fiercely. She went to the pools and sat where Elia had once sat, and put her feet in the water, and the children came to her, because children will always come to someone whose feet are in water and whose face is open, and because the spearmen on the colonnade were handsome. She asked them their names, and then asked their mothers their names, and did not forget either. She watched two boys fight over a little boat, and made them share, and learned the first rule of kingdoms. Everything is a little boat. Ariohota moved men like furniture, quietly, and with his back. He knew how to make a hallway into a gauntlet, and how to make a kitchen into a trap, and how to make a tower into a promise. He knew how to be patient with Darkstar's rudeness, by thinking of him as an unbroken horse. Handsome, dangerous, likely to break his own legs in a ditch. He spoke seldom, and then usually in single sentences, that men wrote down with their bodies. He kept a ledger in his head, and each night wrote on it silently. 30 sickles cord, 2 jars oil, 4 jars sand, 3 knives left where they should not have been left. He slept sitting up twice and lying down once. On the 10th day, after Myrcella's crowning, a Lannister ship came to the stepstones, and pretended to be a trader by lowering its banner 3 times before raising it again, when no one was looking. It carried a heavy crate, and a man with a smile that wanted very much to be believed. This was not yet the day when a skull reached Sunspear, but the day had learned the way. Tynene's little birds told her that a knight with a name like a bird would be given the honor of bearing a trophy to the south. She wrote it down, and then erased it with her finger, and then wrote it again, and sent it away without oil this time, because the risk of the scent becoming its own rumor was unwise. Doran's foot swelled, and made a map of pain from ankle to knee. He pushed it into water and let the pain teach him to hear other things. He read Caliot's daily lists in which the maester made amounts into units of breath. Wheat, 5 days. Barley, 7. Salt pork, 3. Wine, forever, because men would always give him more when he asked. He read Ariane's more dangerous lists. Men, women, patience. He read at Ario's very short list that would, if a god were honest, be the last account that mattered. How many steps from Myrcella's bed to the door? How many men between her and the stairs? How many bows within the number of heartbeats that mean life? He placed these lists one upon another like thin leaves, and pressed them between boards in his mind, until the shape they took became something he could write upon and call plan. He sent a letter east by a roundabout road to a name he had no business knowing. It said only, "If wings come west, come first to the desert, because the desert will know how to feed them." He sealed it and laughed at himself for an old man with old dreams, and then stopped because the world was in the habit of surprising him in both directions. He sent another letter to the Stormlands, measured, courteous to the old grudge, acknowledging their dead and naming 2 small debts Dorne owed, and would pay, because men can sometimes be led with accounts settled, rather than blood ears. He sent another to Old Town, and did not pretend to tell the Citadel anything it did not already know. Only said that knowledge could be made into a wall, if one wanted, and that Dorne had mortar to share. Oberra slept one night at Summerhall, and woke to a sound she could not at first place. The sound of a bird, too big for the trees. It was only wind in the broken chimneys, and she cursed it for trickery. But for an instant, she had believed in a kind of magic. She had always refused. The magic of men's names bound to stones. She spat, and then stood, and then led her men away before their sleep could learn the sound and make it real. Lady Fowler wrote to Doran in an angular hand that made even pleasantries look like commands. "We cannot keep them forever," she said. "We can keep them long enough to change their minds. If you wish me to change them further, send me something that burns without smoke." Doran sent oil and good clay pots, and a man from Godsgrace who knew how to make fire behave like a gentleman in the afternoon and a beast at night. Tarly sent word up the pass that the bones of his men deserved a fairer resting than the shade of thorn bushes. Lady Fowler sent down a cask of wine and a note. "The dead are indifferent. Drink." He sent the cask back unopened. She uncorked it and poured it upon the stones. A libation to heat and to pride, and the boys cheered because they were boys, and such theatrics teach them not to become fools. The older men watched their lady do a wasteful thing, and decided they admired her for it. Because waste is sometimes the only prayer that the desert comprehends. In King's Landing, Cersei placed her hand upon Tommen's head and spoke vows to heir because no one else in the room would have believed them. The boy blinked and tried to love the feel of the crown as his cousin did, far away, without yet knowing he had a cousin, or a queen in him somewhere he would never be allowed to touch. Margaery walked beside him and counted the breaths between him and a true king. Qyburn smiled in places where smiles were not required. The bells learned the name of Myrcella and said it differently each day. Some sang it with scorn because their ropes pulled them that way. Some sang it with hope because they had heard the green blood in dream. A wagon found its way into the marches with pots nested like eggs. In each pot, a certain oil waited. It would break in flame if a man sneezed unluckily. Nymeria Sand's signature upon the order had been a little flourish, as if to say, the desert has delicacies too. On the third night, after the wagon began its climb, a patrol of men with stamped roses crossed the road behind it. They did not stop the wagon. They stopped at a stream and cupped water with their hands, and spoke a rhyme about girls that their fathers had taught them. The wagon rolled on, and a boy walking behind it counted the stars, and said the names of the ones he knew, and made up names for the rest with the bravado of the very young. That boy would live. He had already taught himself the right insolence toward the sky. Ariohota stood with Arianne upon the highest step of Sunspear, and looked east until their eyes were tired. "You wanted this years ago," he said, because gentleness between them did not require lies. "I wanted to be seen," she said. "Perhaps I wanted to be crowned because I thought crowns were attention. I am not ashamed to have wanted it, but I am ashamed to have wanted it without wondering how much it weighed." "It weighs the same even when you know," Ario said. "The knowing only strengthens your shoulders." "My shoulders are not yours," Arianne said, warm. "They are smaller, but they are mine, and they do not belong to any man who thinks his mind is a better crown than my head." "Da." He grunted assent. He liked her because she had ceased to be clever and become useful, which in Arios' book was the difference between silk and rope. "Darkstar watches you," he said, and felt the weather shift within her. "I let him," she said. "It is easier to aim his eyes than to block them. Besides, there are some men who lose interest the moment you fail to flinch, and some who do not. I know the names of both kinds," Arianne said. "I have written them here." She touched her stomach, and he understood that the book she meant was the one where a woman kept her private list of prices and profits, and the names of men who would find no welcome in her bed or at her table. They stood in a silence that was not empty. Ravens kicked at their perches. The sea made a noise like paper turned. From below, boys' voices braided and unbraided, carrying some ridiculous song about a princess and a lizard lion that made Arianne laugh out loud before she remembered that laughter, too, is a kind of proclamation, and let it ring on. By the third week, the war had learned the shape of itself. It would not be one of those neat things with a name that fits upon a bard's tongue as cleanly as a pearl upon a thread. It would be dust and thirst and place. The reach would press and the passes would hold, and then give and then hold again, and each time both armies would learn something about themselves, which is the sorrow of good wars. For men who learn are dangerous later. Tarly would measure and choose. Mace would bluster and arrive late and call it a plan. Cersei would write orders like a woman writing letters to men she thinks she loves. Qyburn would dig with his mind as spade. Tiny would smile and teach food to behave as knife when nothing else would. Nymeria would send boats and laughter. Obara would turn ambushes into exercise. Anders would save lives by being rude. Lady Fowler would hold the pass as if it were a lover's hand she preferred to bite rather than surrender. Doran would count the days and put them on the shelf with his pain and call the heap victory, only when calling it anything else would make the heap fall down. On an evening heavy with lemon and tar, a rider came into Sunspear with a way of holding his posture that made Ariohota think of a man trying to carry something that would not be carried by hands. He was from the marches, and he had seen a column of gold cloaks and green cloaks together, and he had heard a commander say the words, "King's Landing," and "March," and "Fast." He told Ario this, and then told him it again, as if afraid the words would melt if not repeated. Ario took him up to Doran and stood by while the prince listened. "They will come down the Roserad?" Arianne asked, tracing the route with a forefinger upon an invisible table. "Not at first," the rider said, grateful and frightened. "They will go to Bitterbridge and then to the Mander and make a great show of nothing, because it will take them 3 days to agree who gives the order to piss. Then they will turn to the marches, because no man of the Reach wants to admit he cannot take stone from a woman. Forgive me, my lady." "I do not forgive you," Arianne said, "because you have done nothing to be forgiven. We will be ready." "Now." Doran turned his head toward Ario. "Send to Hellholt. Tell the Ullers that if they intend to be trouble, now is the hour to be trouble in the right direction. Tell them I will forgive one old murder if they give me one new loyalty. Then send to Starfall. Tell Dane that I need a shadow that can walk by day." Ario inclined his head and left to turn words into men. In King's Landing, Balin Swan knelt as Cersei entrusted him with an errand that had title and no joy. "Take this gift to Sunspear," she said, and her smile was a weapon with no scabbard. He took the crate and did not ask to see it, which was gentlemanly and also wise. Margaery watched him go and thought about husbands and about brothers. Tyene watched him go and thought about roots. Qyburn watched him go and thought about weights and acids and the limits of names. The crate crossed from ship to ship and island to island, and rumor ran before it like a boy with a torch told to make people come to windows. When it landed upon the jetty at Sunspear, the spearmen watched it come with expressions carved gentle and hands hard. Doran had the crate carried not into the great hall, but into a small room with no windows, where a table had been scrubbed with salt. And a priest had once said words no one remembered now. He had it opened and looked in, and did not flinch, not because the thing was not terrible, but because flinching would have made it appear he had been surprised. He touched the skull with 2 fingers, and then wiped his fingers on a cloth, and put the cloth down, and did not look at it again. "Send for Maester Caliot," he said. "If the mountain is here, I want him weighed." The Maester tapped the skull with the fingernail of his smallest finger, as if it were a melon, and he a cook. He spoke measures and estimates. He said, "It could be. It is heavy enough. The brow ridges are pronounced. The jaw crushed my sister's child," Doran said. And his voice did not rise. "The jaw belongs in the desert. Later. For now, we must give King's Landing a show of an end. We will say we accept this as proof. We will not say what else we have planned." He sent Balin Swan away with courtesies sharpened to points. Tyene watched the knight's face and concluded that he was the kind of man who would press his grief down until it became a coin he could spend without noise. She did not try to poison him, not because she could not, but because he was not the coin Doran needed to change. She chose a different coin. A certain master of whisperers had left his spider's nets to starve. Tyene fed one with breadcrumbs and then with small facts until he mistook her hand for the world's generosity. When the time came, she would pull him from his web and shake him out like a cloth. Doran called his council, not the great names, the names that men who do great things borrow and then forget to return. He called the woman who had organized the kitchen's bequests when a lord died. He called the man whose job was to watch when men's boots became holes. He called the water lord who, when a boat overturned, could tell by the ripples whether a child would drown. He asked them for their fears, not their hopes. He took their fears into his ledger and filed them beside the hill of skulls, and the weight of men, and the passes, and the green blood. Then he stood with his stick in his pain and said, "We go forward, not because war is a virtue, because forward is the direction water takes, and we are children of water who learn to live beside sands. We are remembered for the patience we keep, and the promises we do not forget. We will teach the realm both. We will teach the realm both." The days shortened by fictions, the eye told itself to bear the heat. In the prince's past the Reach raised an engine that looked like a spider and threw firepots into the thorns to make them less democratic. Lady Fowler sent women to fetch the pots with hooks and throw them back. And for a time war resembled children in a schoolyard tossing a ball until the ball broke and covered everyone in a lesson. Tarly shifted left and found no ground. He shifted right and found less. He shifted forward a hand's breadth and paid 2 days for it. Men began to whisper that the pass had always been there, but had never before chosen to notice them. A commander can deal with thirst, and with sleep, and with fools, but when a road begins to mock him, he must choose either to make a different road or to break the mountain. Tarly was not equipped to break mountains. He began to make a different road, and that road bent toward the Boneway, toward Anders Yaronwood's contempt, and toward the goat tracks that led to places men had not, until recently, believed were part of their world at all. Obera came out from Summerhall at last, having left her absence there in lieu of news. She went east, then north, snaking her column through scrub and over salt flats that had learned the shape of hoofprints well enough to forgive them. Twice she set ambushes for ghosts, shapes she thought she saw at dusk that turned out to be cedars, and laughed aloud in the dark at herself. Once she came upon a marcher patrol at a waterhole and sat within sight, drinking, and told the reachman with a lifted cup, "This is a thing we can share," and watched them decide to hate her less for that 1 hour. One of them tried to speak to her of peace. She listened. He spoke of bread and wives and wished he were home. She spoke of sisters. He had none. They parted with less elegance than such meetings are supposed to have, but neither drew blood, and that day no mother in either country paid that particular price. On the last night before the moon went thin, Ariohota walked the water gardens alone. He went to the pool where Elia used to sit, and where Myrcella had lately tried to learn how to be both girl and queen. He put his hand upon the water, and felt the cool climb into his palm, as if it were a creature eager to live elsewhere. He thought of Norvus. He thought of a great axe, with a blade as broad as a cat's back. He thought of a boy's hand being set into a groove worn by other hands and being told, "Here is how you belong." He thought of Doran sleeping at last under a blanket that would never be heavy enough to stop his mind. He thought of Ariane's shoulders. He thought of Tynene's smiles and of Obara's laughter, and of Nymeria's writing, and of a list that would never be finished. He drew his hand from the water and let the drops fall on the stone and decided, quietly, that if anyone ever asked him what war had taught him, he would say, "It taught me to count." He would say it without pride and without shame, and with his long axe across his back and his eyes on doors. The wind turned that night. It came out of the east, tired by long travel, carrying with it the kind of dust that tastes faintly of salt, because it has been loved by water once and has not quite forgotten. Men woke and sniffed and said to one another that in the morning the light would be whiter and the heat less sulky. Doran woke with less pain, or else with other pains that made the first seem less interesting. He put his bare feet on cool tile and thought of his brother playing among crabs, and he said again the name that had become less a grief and more an obligation, and he tied his mantle and he called for Ariohota, and for his daughter, and for his letters, and for his letters, and for his spear. They went out onto the balcony. The sea lay like a blade waiting to be lifted. The city's roofs shone like scales. The passes held their breath. King's Landing played at queen and mother and priest, and the Red Keep stooped as if fearing wind. Between desert and river, between mountain and orchard, between law and love, a long line had been drawn from Sunspear's tiles to the black mouth of the city on the black water. It was a line of intention. Men would walk it and die on it, and be changed by it. The prince set his hand upon the parapet and felt the stone's heart beat, old and stubborn. "Forward," he said, so softly that only the wind heard. The wind took it as if it had been waiting all its life to be sent. It ran the line north while the desert learned the next word. "Okay." The east wind lifted before dawn and ran its fingers through the passes, reading each stone as if the mountain were a book it had mislaid and now rediscovered. It made the thorns whisper. It tapped at empty gourds strung to chords like ill-tempered chimes, and it brought the kind of cool that has no future in it, but only this hour, this breath, this reprieve. Obara Martell woke to it and smiled without sentiment. She made the rounds on foot, the iron butt of her spear knocking once on each rock that held a boy with a bow behind it, so that the boy would remember both the weight of the spear and the reason for the rock. "E8," she said, and the word traveled down the line with the same exactness the wind used to travel up. Men chewed with care to avoid thirst. A Fowler girl, the same who had broken the trumpeter's song with a fig hook in a hard lesson, sat cross-legged in the dust and showed a younger boy how to wrap a leather thong around the notch of the arrow, so a damp hand would not betray him. She talked as if the arrow had ears and a bad temper, and could be soothed by praise. By mid-morning the mist had bled away. The reach banners were smaller than the mountain liked to make them appear, a kindness that the mountain does for its friends, diminishing the enemy to keep hearts steady until arrows begin. A thin line of men in green cloaks advanced to the music of harness and discipline. They moved like a loom draws thread. 3 times they halted to pluck a thorn or unbind a fallen horse. Twice they advanced again with commendable neatness. "Randall," Obara said to herself, seeing the Align's patience and its hunger to be offended. "You are stingy with mistakes. Good." She sent a runner to the right-hand spur with 2 stones and a word. "Wait." On the left spur, she allowed the old men to mutter. Old men who had spent their lives counting the mountain's moods ought to be permitted a mutter now and then, provided no decision ever resulted from it. The first volley went high at Obara's order, as if the mountain itself had thrown a handful of gravel at the reach. It was not meant to kill. It was meant to teach. The second volley, coming as the men lifted shields and named the gods of orchard and field, slipped in low under the rind and found the meat. The horses answered more loudly than the men because they were innocent, and because innocence has a larger mouth. Tarly's horn did not trouble itself. He redressed the line by the length of a forearm and gave the next advance in gestures and looks. Obara nodded to him across the gorge and learned his habits. He did not waste. He did not rush. He took the pass's insult and considered it as if it were a bill for a middling extravagance, one he would pay but not repeat. By noon, heat had sloped into cruelty. The thorns did their work with democratic zeal, catching silk and wool with the same indifferent teeth. Obara's archers grew stingy with arrows. The day had too many mouths for a man to be generous. She sent girls with goatskins low along the scree to wet lips and to wet, more importantly, bowstrings. The girls moved like smoke, scolding the rocks with their bare feet when they tried to tell them gravity's old stories. By afternoon, the reach had crossed 2 small gullies and been paid for the first with 6 men, and for the second with 11. Obara had the slope crouch and breathe, and the slope did so. When the sun leaned down, a white pennon went up. "Truce," and a slender man in a clean surcoat rode forward, his horse placing its hooves with the polite horror of a creature who has understood knives. He did not lower his head. He had the sort of face that keeps accounts cleanly. "I am Sir Killian Fossaway," he called across the shallow draw. "Lord Tarly wishes to speak with the Lady of Skyreach." Obara spat aside without insult. "Lady Fowler is not a puppet who answers when you pull a string," she said. "But Dorn does not refuse courtesy. Put your horse to the stone with care and bring no more than 2. Sir Killian came on, light as a word unburdened by a lie. Lady Fowler received him on a shelf of rock that had learned over centuries to be a kind of bench. She wore her hair in its lacquered tower. The wind pretended to court it and failed. Her men stood back far enough to be humility and near enough to be consequence. "Sir," she said, and the word made no promise, "you will forgive me for not offering you water." "I brought my own," he said, which she respected. "Your lord? He asks a path for the wounded to be carried out," said Fossaway. "He offers in exchange a day's peace and leave for you to collect your dead as well." "Kind," Lady Fowler said dryly, "that he remembers we, too, keep our dead close." She looked toward the ridge where Tarly's standard stood like an upright thought. "Tell your lord he may have the path he asks. He will not keep it. There are no paths a man may keep here. Sister paths and goat paths and old grudge paths. He may have one for his wounded today. We will keep the day's peace tomorrow and eat figs with the memory of it between our teeth." "Then?" Fossaway inclined his head. He looked, Arya would later think when he read the report, like a man who had been born in the wrong country. Too neat for the marches, too stubborn for Highgarden, too proud to be at court. When he rode back through the thorns, he rode as if he believed the plants would injure him out of a critique of grace, and the thorns obliged. Why? Obara asked when Lady Fowler had sent Fossaway away and kept his courtesy without absorbing it. No debt of ours lie unclaimed. We teach them how to ask, Lady Fowler said. Each lesson in the pass is a lesson for the road beyond it. Do you think they will not one day ask us for a treaty? For peace? For a marriage? They will. Best they learn now to keep their saddle and their hands while they ask. Obara laughed, not to mock. She liked the thought. She kept her men still as the wounded were borne out, and when one reach boy, sweating and white-lipped with pain, murmured, "Thank you," without meaning to, she did not hear him. Courtesy would cost him someday. She would not be the one to set the habit. In the Boneway, Anders Euron would discipline the pass with contempt, as if it were a squire who had left his lord's boots unpolished. He shifted men by the hour, building fatigue into the enemy's expectations. He wrote to Doran that the mountain ate men not with teeth, but with patience, and that he, Anders, was the better jaw. He set a pitfall where the shale lay treacherous, not to kill but to break the knees of 4 horses out of 20. He stole time and sold it back to the Reach at a markup. When a marcher knight clambered up to parley with a banner of truce, Anders kept him standing 3 turns of the glass before giving him a stool, and then took it away again, because it amused him to train strangers. Stop being amused, came Obara's next letter. They bleed less when you are distracted. Spoken like a woman who expects all work to be a plow. Anders penned in reply, "This work is sometimes a sickle. Both harvest. I will bring you grain cut to your preference. Nenderu." Nymeria's green blood rang with a coat of bells finer than any gold lace. One bell, struck hard, meant boats hugging the eastern reed line where the water drinks sunlight and hides it. 2 quick bells meant move at night, because the Reach's eyes have found the day. A low bell meant children on the bank and caution for their games. A high bell meant a lord's temper somewhere ahead on the road and to keep insults under 10 words. She wrote to Doran that the river taught men to be reasonable, because it never once apologized for the bends it took. And Ario thought that was the sort of sentence a sharp girl keeps in her pocket to spend when an older man doubts her. Tiny Sands smiled less in King's Landing. She found that the more carefully a city listened to its own words, the less it could bear a gentle face. She traded the lavender basket for a spool of rough twine and a knife with a notch in its handle, and a woman's shawl patched in 3 places with 3 different hands. She watched the faith's ragged men, the ones who had walked their feet raw and their throats to fury. She brought a kettle to a hook and sold bowls of thin stew that tasted better, because the steam told men they would live until nightfall. She counted coins without moving her lips and counted fools without moving her eyes. The Sept of Baelor stood like a conscience patrolled by birds. The new High Septon was a man with a history the city had already rewritten 3 times. He spoke softly and mostly to those who were near enough to smell him. Tiny came near enough by night to count the number of men at his door and far enough by day to see the hunger in the faces of women who nodded to his sermons. A hunger for rules that made pain feel like wages rather than theft. She walked the steps once with bare feet as others did, and laughed at herself afterward, in private for unnecessary piety, and kept the information the stone gave her. Its damp, its tilt, its habit of catching a heel. If a man thought too highly of his own cadence, Qyburn's rooms breathed wrong. Even the candles seemed to lean away from the work, as if wax had sense. Tyene found a boy who emptied the buckets there and gave him a wrist guard for his sling and a strip of salted pork, and taught him the names of 3 herbs that would help him sleep without dreams. He told her without being asked that some nights the humming stopped and the silence weighed more. She gave him a prayer to say, one of Dorn's little practical prayers that sound like advice and taste like resolve, and sent him away with enough copper to feel as if he had stolen them. Men keep better secrets for thieves than for patrons. Cersei Lannister made haste and fog. She announced taxes as if taxes made soldiers. She slapped her brother in words as if words could bruise plate. She sent letters to the lords of the Stormlands demanding fealty they were not withholding, and to the Dornish demanding submission that would rot in the heat before it reached the passes. Margaery poured wine for her and smiled elsewhere. When Mace Tyrell spoke of marching, Cersei agreed with a greedy suddenness that made men who understood war shift in their chairs. She distrusted Tarly because he did not admire her without being told to. and she trusted Mace because he admired himself without being told to. Tyne saw this and tucked it away. The cheapest dagger in a city is vanity. Balin Swan took ship with the crate and the expression of a man determined to be adequate in a world that has lately forgotten how to weigh adequacy. Tyne considered taking his ship for the sake of the crate and decided against it. There is a time to make martyrs and a time to make messengers. She let him be the latter. Sunspear received him with a hospitality polished by rage. Ariohota watched him walk the length of the long room beneath carved arches that made men feel as if the world had arranged itself properly, if only for this 1 hour. Strong stone, cool water, measured distance between a guest and a stab. The skull was uncrated in that small windowless room, where the walls remembered prayers nobody could now quote. Doran's fingers came away dry with old dust and older accusation. Maester Calliotta talked bones. Doran talked babies. When it was done, Doran sent word to the hall and had the skull shown. Briefly, and not as a trophy, but as a conclusion written by men who owed him more than this. Myrcella stood and did not faint. Tristane did not flinch. The room took its breath in, and Ario counted. 3 heartbeats too long to be safe. 3 too many to be shame. Then the breath went out, and took with it some small part of a long grief. Not because the act was right, but because grief accepts counterfeit coins when it is starving. "Tell your queen that Dorn accepts this skull," Doran said to Sir Balin. The words clean as new minted copper. "Tell her that when the world sees justice done without knives, men remember their children. Tell her also that justice done in a cellar makes a poor foundation for a kingdom." Sir Balin nodded. He carried no visible pride. He wore no shame. He left with the same soldier's adequacy with which he came, and Tyne inclined her head to him as he passed her in the corridor, not because she was kind, but because sometimes you offer a man a coin he will not spend and keep it as your own later. She had the feeling she would see him again in some other room, where men would expect him least, and she would want to like him, and choose not to. Arianne held court that evening with Myrcella beside her, the girl's hair lit from the braziers, so that she seemed to carry the sun on her head as if she had been born under Nymeria's banners. Petitioners brought small wars with them and asked to be told whether they were lawful. Myrcella learned to ask for the other side of a story before she settled it. She learned to ask whether a husband's temper had been as constant before the drought as after. She learned to ask whether a boy could keep a goat penned without learning something he ought not learn from the goat. She laughed twice, once at a little boy who announced that he had come to marry a princess and produced a ring plated from rushes, once at her own mistake regarding a toll on the Greenblood, which she corrected out loud and without shame. A girl who can say, "I was wrong," in a room full of men is a dangerous thing. Ario wrote it down on his ledger as if it were a spear counted and oiled. Night made the passes into thought. Tarly set pickets with a precision that shamed men who assumed Reachman did not know rock. He had a far-roving mind. It went down ravines in daylight to see if the night would try the same. He counted fires and forbade a second log on any. He cut the tongues from a man who sang after dark. He wrote a note to Mace Tyrell with neat letters that said nothing of his contempt. "Bring me grain on mules, not barrels and carts. Bring me vinegar for water. Do not bring me singers." Mace sent grain in barrels on carts and 3 singers and a retinue. The retinue arrived at Knight's Ridge and made a show of measuring distances with the mouths of their horses. Obara watched from a fold in the slope and wanted to spit, but did not. She sent 4 men down to steal harness while the retinue slept, and Garland Tyrell woke to a horse with no bit, and laughed, because his mind is excellent and not proud, and because excellence sometimes recognizes discipline, even when it is an enemy's. He sent the harness back up on a boy's back with a note. "Well done. Waste no more labor on this. Your time is better spent on wells." Obera showed the note to Lady Fowler. They were not friends. There are women who do not become friends because the world needs them to remain exact. "This one," Obara said of Garland, "will be a knife if they choose him. I prefer hammers among my enemies. They are easier to hear coming." "They will choose the hammer," Lady Fowler said with the scorn of prophecy. "Be grateful. Knives come when you have stopped expecting noise." In Sunspear, Doran slept late one morning. When he woke, pain had loosened its grip by one knuckle. He walked with a cane to the balcony and took his lemons without sugar. He watched the wake of a narrow ship cut the harbor and wondered how many children could be fed with the money poured into sails and bows and men's glory. He sent a letter east by a ship that would not name its ports to anyone who could not name 5 spices. The letter was short. To Daenerys Stormborn, if this finds you, and if the gods are feeling literal today, the desert remembers its oaths and keeps them salted. Come gently to us or not at all. He sealed it with wax, and with the smell of a fruit he did not taste. He liked to ask the world for things. The world liked to ignore him. They had found a peace in that exchange. Sometimes the world answered. He did not expect it. That was the trick. Another letter came not from the sea, but from the high woods. It had been carried by men who did not belong to the citadel and did not own ships. Its seal was a banner no longer flown in sunlight. A blue hand, clenched upon white. Doran broke it and read in a hand he did not know until he knew it. Connington. The words were few and keeping their breath. An heir had landed in the Stormlands with a company that had not broken a contract in 100 years. A castle had fallen as if it were a fruit too ripe for the branch, and the hand that had plucked it wanted to talk. Doran felt his pulse climb the same stair it had climbed the night Oberyn's raven had come. Then he made it stand on that step and not go higher. "Ario," he said, later, in the solar where the shelves were beginning to sag with the weight of plans. "My daughter goes to the marches." Ario did not like the taste of the words, because there's a carefully kept bridge in a man's chest between duty and love, and sometimes the wind makes it sing, and sometimes it tries to shake it down. He said only, "When?" "When the passes are stouter for the heat," Doran answered. "When Tarly is looking at Anders and thinking of his mother. When Cersei has written 3 foolish letters in a row, so that the 4th looks like wisdom. When Myrcella has learned to say a mercy that sounds like an order. She will go to meet a man who calls himself Griff, and who may be grimmer than the word suggests. She will listen and bring me back the soil of his shoes." Mendermining. Arianne came when called and stood tall in boots she had chosen for their sound on stone. Her face had the light that comes to a woman who has found, not her mirror, but her measure. "Send me," she said simply. "I will return with the truth or with a marriage proposal or with a knife in a sleeve. You may approve the order yourself." "You will go," Doran said. "You will take men who think before they bleed. You will take men who can bleed and keep thinking. You will take a maester who does not love Old Town more than he loves hunger. You will take Darkstar." Mensa, wow. "Must I?" She let humor show because it was more dangerous to hide it. "You must," Doran said. "Send him before you and after you. Let him fall in love with the sun off your ring and forget his reflection once. He is a blade. Blades are used. Wear gloves." She bowed. Ario watched Darkstar's name sit between them like a dish both guests intend to ignore at table, until the host insists upon a serving. He prepared his own measures. Extra eyes, extra water, extra rope, a new tally of who, in the marches, owed Dorne a favor and who would rather eat dirt. He had men find the old smuggler's steps through the scrub, where old raiders had once run from Ghost Hill to the foothills, with a bale of stolen Myrish silk on their backs, and a laugh in their throats. He counted every place a spear butt might strike without echo. That night, Obara came in from the pass with dust in her hair, and the sort of exhaustion only earned by honest enemies. She ate standing and leaned her head against a column to borrow some of its mercy. Ario told her of Arianne's road and she grimaced, not from fear but because she had seen too many knives disguised as invitations. "I will ride with her to the far water," she said. "Then I will leave her with men who would shame a lion by their caution, and come back and make the pass unpleasant for any who think to follow." "My thanks," Arianne told her quietly, and Obara grunted and drank and pounded her chest once with the heel of her hand to make the wine remember its manners. King's Landing had begun to sweat fear. You could smell it under the lavender the Tyrells used, and the vinegar Cersei swore by. The dwarf had not been found. Tywin's ghost tripped servants on stairwells. A rumor that a queen had been crowned in Sunspear grew antlers, tails, wings. It grew into a rumor that Dorne had summoned old gods from the river to march north carrying water on their backs like men. Taini spread no rumors at all for a week, and they were replaced by worse ones, which taught her what she needed. A city prefers its tyrants to its emptiness. She gave it little tyrannies to love. A pickpocket caught and sent to scrub floors in a sept rather than to the headsman. A baker fined for watering his dough and made to give free crusts to an orphanage that would remember the crusts more kindly than it would remember a proclamation. She made the city believe in small power, and in believing it would become blind to the larger knife moving at its edges. The faith took to the streets one hot afternoon with brooms rather than cudgels. They swept the steps of Baelor until the dust rose like a new liturgy. Cersei watched from a window slit with the delight of a child who does not yet understand the rules of games, but has learned how to throw pieces. She decided to make holy men into soldiers and soldiers into holy men. Qyburn hummed in his cellars until the humming became a new kind of breath. Margaery watched boys from the street, who had begun as beggars, and found a rhythm in the work of sweeping. She counted them the way she counted flowers, as if their stems could be braided. Taini counted them as if their hands could. The second battle in the Prince's Pass did not have a name either. It had a smell. Stones that have been warmed all day deny the night its right to coolness. Men sleep with their faces to rock to take something of a day's memory into their dreams. Tarly came in flatter, like a hand pressed hard upon a table to find the crack. Lady Fowler withdrew in rounds, keeping the scale but changing the song. When Tarly sent a party up the gully that the old shepherds kept for goats, they found sheep dung arranged as if to mark a trail, and the trail led them to a place where sheep never walked, because sheep are not fools. It was a ditch lined with thorns. A horn sounded. Men fell in with the stubborn surprise of men who had thought their maps had manners. Tarly did not punish his scouts. He salted the ditch. The next day, he sent his men to gather thorns for their own fences and made them work at noon so they would remember to hate Dorne honestly. In the Boneway, a reach captain named Heatherspoon tried a pretty thing. Pikes bunched like a bouquet. Men in tight column, the better to push through a pinch. And Anders Yarwood let him do it until the column center had passed a mark. A white rock he had set upright the day before, and then rolled stones not to crush, but to scare. The column flinched at the back and shoved at the front, and in the pinch men learn what kind of men they are. Heatherspoon died because he stayed too long explaining that they were to stay calm. The men lived because they stopped listening. Anders wrote to Doran, "They saved themselves accidentally. We must remain deliberate." Darkstar came to Arianne in a yard with a half-ruined wall and kissed her hand as if his mouth were made of mirrors. He wore purple dark as bruises and a smug violence about the eyes that made Ario itch. Arianne moved her hand away as if to test the air. "You will ride ahead," she told him. And he smiled the way some men do when they realize they have been seen and enjoyed in the same breath. "You will find me a road through the marches where no man can accuse me of making war upon houses that might one day wish I were their aunt." "Shall I bring you a flower from the Stormlands?" he asked. "Bring me the name of a miller who knows which lords pay late," she said. "Bring me the color of the cloak Connington's men wear when they pretend not to be paid. Bring me the truth. Just once. Darkstar, bring me the truth without a sound." He laughed. He would not do as asked. He would do something adjacent to sense and call it obedience. Ario gave 2 men he trusted to guard Darkstar's back without letting him know they were guarding anything but their own boredom. Obara watched him go with the indifferent fury of a woman who has learned to spare her spare fury. They left Sunspear on a morning that would have made poets waste ink. Arianne did not look back because she had already given the place the proper leaving. She had stood alone an hour before the sky softened and told the stone the shape of her vow to return. Ario rode to the Greenblood and back with them, and took the place of a pillar in the boat, while the ferryman tugged along the long rope between posts, as old as Dorne's pride. Myrcella came to watch and bit her lip, but did not ask to come. Trystane stood with her and held the choice to offer his arm. He did not. She would ask him for it if she wanted it. When Arianne lifted a hand, Myrcella lifted hers. The bells along the Greenblood gave their small bright notes in a pattern that meant, "Go. Come, mighty de. Go." Come back." The marches smelled of rosemary and resentment. Arianne rode soft and spoke still softer to men who preferred to remember Dorne as a rumor. She laughed at jokes that had worn grooves in benches for 50 years and brought new jokes in her saddlebags. She sent gifts where gifts cost less than the grudges would cost later. She took nothing she could not pay for with coin or respect. In the evenings, she sat with the maps and with the men who could read them, and with the women who could read faces, which is a rarer talent. 2 nights in, a rider came in with word that an old banner had been raised at Griffith's Roost, and that men were taking oaths with the relief of men who had been trying not to drown politely. Arianne folded the map. "We shall see whether this boy is a river or a well," she said. In King's Landing, Marguerite knelt to kiss Tommen's brow with the composure of a woman who has resolved to make the best of someone else's childhood. Cersei wrote a letter to the Iron Bank demanding patience, and did not notice that the ink's bite upon the paper looked like a sneer. Qyburn gave Cersei a knight without a face, and named him with a courtesy that would have been comedy in another city. Tyne watched 2 guardsmen draw lots to see who would accompany their new silent companion on rounds, and thought of the mountain's skull in the small windowless room in Sunspear, and of the cloth upon which Doran had wiped his fingers. Roses. She whispered to herself, a warning to her own mind not to be seduced by the perfume of spectacle. We deal in thorns. In the passes, men learned the exact length of their shadows at noon, and the worth of an extra finger's breadth of shade. They learned that the wind would change its mind without malice, and that mirage was the desert's joke, and not their failure of will. They learned that Goat-Herder's Gully was not named for goats, and never had been. They learned the name of Skyreach's lady, and spoke it with a respect they had not thought to spend on anyone beyond their own borders. They learned the shape of an ambush when it wore patience like a shawl. They learned to hate Dorne more honestly, which is to say they learned to fear it less. And Doran counted. He counted days and jars and arrows, and letters and small courtesies, and larger cruelties, and he set them in their rows in his mind until the pattern became a law, and the law became a road. He sat some afternoons with Marcella, and told her the names of the winds that come from the sea, and the ones that come down off the mountains, and the different courts of men, and how they must all be fed differently. And sometimes she fell asleep with her head tipped, and he did not wake her. He wrote to Old Town, and sent less deference than any prince had sent before, and more frankness. He wrote to the Stormlands and offered more to the small lords than the big ones, because big men mistake an offer for a threat, and small men mistake it for friendship. In both mistakes lay room for Dorne. When Arianne met the man called Griff at dusk under a hill with a stand of wind-twisted oaks, she greeted him as if he were a cousin from the wrong side of a polite feud. He was older than the name suggested, and carried the shame of failure like a cloth that had been well laundered and folded twice and set aside without being thrown away. He stood a step behind the boy who watched Arianne with a stillness older than his bones. The boy's hair had the black of winter sky, and his eyes had the hard blue of ice turned to steel. He did not speak first, and in that Arianne recognized something dangerous. A prince or a boy who believed he might be one, who had already learned to spend silence before he spent words. "I am Arianne of House Martell," she said, smiling with the same degree of courtesy she would offer a tile in the water gardens when it had been lifted and replaced perfectly. A compliment to craft, not to stone. "My father sends me to see whether the Stories wear boots. You are either the Stories' father or its midwife. I will be satisfied with either." Griff bowed just enough to pay for a meal he did not wish to eat. "We hope to be kings," he said. "Stories will do what they must." "They usually do," Arianne said. "But stories that ignore law are like water that ignores its banks. They make a mess. Dorne owns thicker banks than most." "Duh. What would your banks require?" Griff asked. "That depends on your river," Arianne answered. "I will see it. I will taste it. And I will decide whether it deserves the desert." The boy with ice eyes smiled once, quick and sharp. "And if we are a flood?" he asked. "Then we will build boats," Arianne said. They sat upon the ground and made words less grand than banners and more binding than knots. Arianne asked the questions Doran had taught her to ask. Who feeds you? Who keeps you from killing one another when you are angry? Where do you bury your dead? What songs do you forbid your men to sing? Because they make them forget the work. She asked about the Golden Company and watched the boy's face when he spoke its name. She saw debt there, and an honest debt, and she made a note on her private ledger. He pays what he owes. She asked about the Stormlands and about Griffin's Roost, and about a man named Connington, who lived and died in one breath, and then decided to live in another. She asked about a woman with dragons, and laughed inwardly at herself for asking the question like a child, asking whether a Tale's beast had really spoken. We will go where the world lets us, Griff said. We will take Storm's End if we can wheedle the gate like an old friend, or we will pull it down stone by stone and count it exercise. Storm's End has manners, Arianne said. It likes to be wooed. Bring a ladder and a song. She looked at the boy. And bring a name you intend to live with when the singers have forgotten to rhyme it with anything flattering. He did not flinch. Good. She took his measure and found less emptiness than she had expected. That was a problem and a promise. She asked him what he would do with Cersei Lannister when she reached for a crown that had already cut one king's head twice. And he said, I will let her keep it so long as she cannot persuade it to stay. And Arianne laughed aloud because she had not expected wit before supper. She left him with wine that was better than he was used to, and with a scroll that said in clean Dornish hand what Doran would require to make banks for this river. Myrcella's right recognized, Elia named aloud before a hall full of men who had not shown their throats in years, an oath sworn upon the bones of Nymeria and upon the water of the Greenblood, that the desert's children would not be asked again to kneel to those who forgot them. She left with a promise to return in a week, and with 3 roads in her head. Forward, home, sideways to an obligation that had suddenly acquired new teeth. On her way back through the first fold of hills, Darkstar slid out of shadow and smiled. I found you a miller, he said. He owes a fray. I do not know which is more shameful. Arianne took the paper. Good, she said. And will you ever find me a truth unvarnished? Never, Darkstar said cheerfully. What is a truth without its satin? A weapon, she said, and pressed her heels to her mare and went on. In the Prince's Pass, Tarly made one more push and stopped. He sent Foss away to parley again, and Lady Fowler gave him a fig and then 3 olive pits, and told him that he could either swallow pride or choke on it, and that she herself knew how to do both gracefully. He came away with a grudging respect that would, if given any room, grow into a treaty. Oberra did not let it. She staged a raid at dawn that cut 3 ropes on which the Reach had hung their hopes, quite literally, and stole 2 casks of vinegar, and left one in payment with a note carved with a knife in its side. For the boy with the clean hands. Fossaway drank from the cask and did not smile because he suspected a woman had decided where his heart would later tilt, and he was not entirely wrong. Ariohota sat with his back against a pillar and oiled the longax, and listened to Doran plan the next quiet outrage. A line of ships shadowing the coast no farther than sail can outrun gossip. A river of grain that does not know it is going to feed an army until the sacks are cut. A prayer said aloud in a hall full of men who had not heard any other man say prayer without apology. He wrote a small private note in his ledger. The prince grows younger when work is honest. He crossed out the word younger and wrote clearer instead. He slept that night with his hand under the head of the longax, and dreamed not of war but of water, running where water chooses. At dawn the wind laid its hand on Sunspear, as if it had finally agreed to keep company with the city. Myrcella rose early, and walked the colonnade, and stood where Elia had once stood, and where, in a world that had not taken certain babies from certain cradles, other children might have stood and turned the water with their toes. She put her face up and closed her eyes, and the sun kissed her lids through the skin, and made the world red and gold behind them. Trystane came, and did not say anything, and that, too, was a kind of pledge. Doran came to the balcony and counted the sails, and told himself that a day is made of small counting. What is justice but a long addition and a patience with subtraction? The passes held. The Greenblood moved. King's Landing twitched and twined itself toward folly. The stormland stirred under the hand of a man who had been hurt enough to learn. A crown sat upon Myrcella's head and did not tilt. A daughter rode among grudges and made them into paths. A skull rested in a cool room and did less work than the cloth upon which the prince had wiped his fingers. "Forward," he said again, now to men who could hear and to women who already had. "Forward," Obara echoed against a rock that recognized the word, because it had been built into it by 1,000 footsteps. "Forward," Nymeria's bells made into metal. "Forward," Anders muttered like an insult he intended as praise. "Forward," Tyene never said aloud but set into the city with the patience of a seed in dirt that has not yet decided to be generous. And the desert, which remembers better than men do, lifted. The passes, which hold grudges more cleanly than men do, breathed. The sea, which forgives according to its own math, kept beating its hand against the docks and whispering, "Again, again, again."